The wealthiest urban area in the world, London is known as the City of Dreams. Its economy is estimated to be worth approximately $58 billion, or $652 billion, if it were an independent state. This would place London's economy as the 22nd largest in the world, right above Argentina and Sweden. However, London's prosperity, along with southeast England's, is unusual for the nation, a small region that accounts for nearly half of the UK's GDP and has about a third of its population would see a 14% drop in British living standards, barely enough to surpass the US state of Mississippi. Indeed, brighter days have come to the UK. The past 10 years have been very difficult. Income after taxes and perks, or actual disposable income, has hardly changed. In addition, productivity is low, among the lowest of any major economy, and housing has become nearly unaffordable, with the UK holding the record for the highest number of homeless people in the developed world. The cost of goods and services has increased since a decade ago, meaning that people can buy less with their income. These problems are a result of previous political decisions. In light of the fact that there isn't a clear solution to the crisis, Britain has slept through and stumbled through several setbacks. It's ironic that, from a broader perspective, the UK was the first nation to industrialise and now stands to become the first to deindustrialise. Britain's economy is on a downward trajectory. Prices are rising too fast. Just recently, housing prices rose by more than $2,200 in a month. Unfortunately, this wasn't widely reported in the media. Looking at things from all angles is what we do, and Ground News provides us with invaluable insights to do exactly that. That's why we reached out to them to sponsor this video. In fact, reading this on Ground News, I can see only 10 sources covered it, which goes to show how overlooked this subject is. What's more, less than 10% of the outlets were from government sources. One might suppose governments don't want to talk about complications at home. Now, our type of content is not really suitable for YouTube. The algorithm deems it too controversial, and so many of our videos go without monetization. That's why we rely on sponsors to keep producing these videos. We've personally used and worked with Ground News for years, and they've stepped up every time we needed support. In fact, we have our own feed. On Ground News here you get breaking news on geopolitics and even blind spot stories that the media isn't covering. Our missions align, so I encourage you to check it out at Ground News/Caspian. I advise signing up for the Vantage plan. Using this link will save you 40%, but bear in mind that doing so will directly fund our channel. Not too long ago, Britain was regarded as one of the richest countries in the world and a top choice for professionals looking to progress in their careers. Today, however, the state is under extreme socio-economic strain, more so than most people realize. Due to 3 consecutive geopolitical shockwaves, it has enormous debt. But the catalyst for Brexit and the war in Ukraine began in 2008, when the global financial crisis had a lasting impact on all of us. Although Britain suffered significant losses, its response to the fallout distinguished it from other developed nations. After borrowing almost £141 billion to save British banks, the government chose to implement austerity measures rather than make investments in fiscal and social policies. There were no sizable tax cuts or increases in the minimum wage, no inflation control, and no housing assistance. No initiatives to create jobs. You understand the message for regular people. The results were disastrous. For further context, consider that for the next 15 years, real household income fell and then stagnated. This period of time is known as the lost decade in economic terms. The average British household was 8% less prosperous than those in Norway and only 6% behind those in the US in 2007. In the years that followed, the deficit grew significantly, and today's British households are 20% behind those in Norway and 16% behind those in the US in terms of real income. The middle class is particularly affected by this decline in living standards. Real household income is a key factor in economic activity since it raises living standards and stimulates consumer spending, both of which are factors in Britain's economic growth. However, the government gave corporate interests precedence over all other concerns. However, even in this corporate environment, the advantages were primarily fleeting. The productivity rate was neglected, and no substantial. For context, investments were made in this domain. One of the most effective ways to grow an economy is to increase productivity. However, contrary to popular belief, increasing productivity does not require working harder. Rather, the goal is to boost economic output without increasing the amount of work. For example, when an economy based on agriculture shifts to manufacturing microchips, productivity increases because the tech sector is more lucrative and has larger margins. Ergo, the workforce is getting more out of it for the same amount of labor. That's why Japan is turning farmland into factories. It adds to productivity and ultimately improves the economy. In the UK, productivity output per capita debilitated after the 2008 crisis due to a lack of investment. This chart by the London School of Economics puts things into perspective. Before the crisis, productivity was growing at nearly 2% annually. After the crisis, however, it weakened substantially, changing a trend that had been in motion since the 1980s. The British workforce now has the second lowest productivity rate among the G7 economies, whereas before the 2008 crisis it was second only to the US. The simultaneous effects of sluggish real household income and low productivity explain a lot about the performance of the British economy. It is essentially fighting for its life. Britain's lost decade happened so casually, so indifferently, that none of its political parties acknowledged it, let alone addressed it. There was no political discourse on this issue, which affected millions of households despite being a crisis nonetheless. As a result, the discourse took the form of Brexit, but the uncertainty surrounding it made an already dire situation worse. According to the Bank of England, Brexit decreased investment by 25% between 2016 and 2021. Additionally, shortly after Brexit, the start of the COVID-19 pandemic made the already dire economic situation worse. In response, the government borrowed an additional £280 billion, which was deemed necessary to get the country through the pandemic. However, here's the thing. The majority of the COVID bailout was borrowed during a period when interest rates were at historically low levels, roughly 0.1%. Repayments were anticipated to be manageable at the time, and this may have been the case if not for the final blow to the Ukrainian war. As soon as the Russians launched their full-scale assault, access to Russian gas and oil was cut off by trade restrictions and sanctions, sparking an energy crisis that caused prices to skyrocket throughout Europe. When the crisis of this time, it was one of Europe's most generous financial support packages, with an additional $60 to $100 billion going directly towards increasing Britain's debt. Although the damage to households was minimal, the bailout caused the UK to have its largest increase in debt as a percentage of GDP. The combined effects of the pandemic and energy crises caused inflation rates to soar, which in turn caused central banks to hike interest rates for ordinary citizens. This resulted in an overnight increase of hundreds of billions to mortgage payments, while the government's high interest rates added billions more to the national debt. Prior to the energy crisis, the interest paid on Britain's debt currently ranks as the nation's second biggest expense. Tens of billions of pounds less money is now available due to the debt increase, which limits spending on other things. It affects almost all of the nation's public services, which lowers the fundamental quality that public services can offer. Economics is the study of human decision-making and how demographics influence it. It goes beyond markets and money alone. Every advanced economy saw a spike in the labor force as people found jobs and moved on with their lives. This chart illustrates the change in economic activity among the G7 nations between 2019 and 2023. Economics is essentially the study of people, not just numbers. Britain is notable for having a workforce that never recovered, rather, it remained low, and that had several ripple consequences. It entails higher spending on social benefits and lower taxes to fund services like healthcare. Additionally, it implies that consumers have less disposable income, which has a negative impact on firms and the quantity of jobs accessible in an economy. Turn full circle, but the issue with Britain's workforce extends much beyond the missing 1%. Officially, the country's unemployment rate of 4.4%, or 1.5 million people, is low by historical standards, but the real story is quite different. The government refers to the staggering 11 million people who are absent from Britain's workforce as economically inactive, rather than calling it unemployment. This is because 9.4 million of the missing individuals are not actively seeking employment, according to the Office for National Statistics, which outlines their motivations. Approximately 2.1 million people between the ages of 16 and 24 are students, making them economically inactive. Approximately 3.5 million people over 50 have retired early from work due to illness, and at least 1 million people between the ages of 25 and 49 are unemployed as a result of caring obligations. The government is under immense pressure to address the issue of the missing 11 million workers in the workforce, and one way to do so is by opening borders. British lawmakers responded by allowing more immigrants from outside the UK to work in the country, with South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa standing out as these migrant workers fill the gaps left by a reduced workforce. However, at the same time, the rapid and large-scale influx of immigrants has increased social tensions within the country as people feel threatened by the changing ethnic demographics, and some lawmakers have taken advantage of these sentiments to further their political agendas. In early August 2024, anti-immigration protests and riots rocked Britain, affecting over 20 towns. While the riots have peaked, addressing their origins will take much longer to resolve. The Economic A Chronicle, characterized by a steady deterioration, demonstrates how one crisis sets off another, and eventually results in a series of events from which there is no quick respite. On the bright side, every country experiences ups and downs, and the UK is no different. This is the bed that was created, and people now have to lie in it. Things will improve eventually, but for the time being, Britain's economy will perform like that of a third world country. Nevertheless, London remains one of the richest and most creative cities on the globe.